If you're looking for a complete, practical guide to using HighLevel's API with a private integration key in 2026, you're in the right place. If you've ever opened API documentation and immediately felt overwhelmed, don't worry, we're going to break everything down into clear, simple, and digestible steps. In this video, you'll learn what an API actually is, why we use APIs, how to understand API architecture to make your first API call, how to read and understand HighLevel's API documentation, and how to make your first real API call in real time. Make sure you stick around because by the end of this video, we show you step-by-step how to call the HighLevel API using custom webhook actions inside HighLevel, and make the same API call inside n8n using the HTTP node with a simple shortcut that makes this much easier. Once you understand this, you'll have a foundation you can apply to any API endpoint inside HighLevel. And not just that, you'll know how to work with almost any API-based integration, not just HighLevel. Welcome to Aurora AI, the skills accelerator, where agency owners, small businesses, and aspiring developers master AI ecosystems that deliver real results. We break down the smarter approaches, the real-world insights, and the high-leverage decisions behind creating sustainable, reliable, and scalable AI systems, so you can choose the right tech stack and grow without wasting time or money. Let's start with the basics. API stands for Application Programming Interface. It is a set of rules and protocols that enables different software programs to communicate and exchange data with each other. But the easiest way to think about it is this: an API is a messenger. No matter what platform you're using to call an API, you're simply asking another system to perform an action, like fetching data, updating records, creating new entries, or deleting existing ones. That's the role of an API, enabling different systems to communicate with each other in a structured and predictable way. So the real question is, why should you even care about APIs? If you've used HighLevel for any amount of time, you already know there's a lot you can do natively inside HighLevel automation, and we say this from experience because we use HighLevel automation heavily. But here's the reality. Every business runs differently, and eventually, you'll hit a point where HighLevel built-in tools aren't flexible enough to handle your exact workflow. When that happens, you hit a wall. You realize not everything is available. Not every workflow can be built natively. Some logic simply can't be handled in standard automation. That's where APIs change everything. One of the biggest strengths of HighLevel is that it's extremely developer-friendly. HighLevel provides over 200 API endpoints, giving programmatic access to almost every core system function. This means you can extend functionality, build custom workflows, and create entirely new systems on top of HighLevel. This is one of the main reasons HighLevel has grown so fast. It's not just a CRM, it's a platform you can build on. For example, in our voice AI systems, which we teach extensively on this channel, we constantly run into native limitations inside HighLevel. So instead of waiting for new features, we use custom MCP workflows built in n8n to extend what HighLevel can do. But connecting APIs together, we unlock advanced booking logic, full appointment lifecycle management, multi-calendar routing, and real-time decision-making. All of that becomes possible only because of APIs. Now that you understand what an API is and why it matters, let's break down the core concept of how APIs work. Every single API interaction has two parts. Part 1, the request. This is what you're asking for. Part 2, the response. This is what the API sends back. When you send a request, you're basically saying, "Hey, API, I need something from you." And for the API to understand you, your request needs to include what you want, any details needed to identify exactly what you need, and proof that you're allowed to ask.
When the API sends back a response, it includes the data you requested, or an error message if something went wrong, and a status code telling you whether the request succeeded or failed. The simplest way to think about this is you send a letter, you receive a reply. That's the entire idea of API communication.
Now let's examine what actually goes into a request. There are 5 main components. We'll start with a table to outline each one. Don't worry if it feels like a lot at first. We'll go through every part step by step. Part 1. Destination, the URL. This is where your request is being sent. In HighLevel, all API calls go through Lead Connector, which is the infrastructure behind HighLevel. Here's an example URL. This is simply the address your request is going to. As you explore the documentation, you'll notice the same base domain but with different paths, like /contacts, /calendars, /appointments. Each path represents a different group of API actions. Part 2. Action, the HTTP method. This tells the API what you want to do. The main methods you'll use are GET to retrieve data, example, get a contact's details. Post when you want to create something new, example, create a contact or book an appointment. Put or patch to update existing data, example, reschedule an appointment. Delete to remove something, example, cancel an appointment. This is how you tell the API your intention. Part 3. Authentication, proving who you are. Here's how authentication looks inside a request. Header name, authorization. Header value, bearer, your token. That long string after the bearer prefix is your private token. This information is passed inside the request headers, which are special instructions sent along with every request. Most APIs aren't public. You must prove that you're allowed to make requests. That's done using an API key or token. A token is a long string of letters and numbers that works like a password. In HighLevel, one way to get this token is through private integration, which we'll set up later. And in HighLevel, this token always belongs in the authorization header, not in the URL and not in the request body. Now let's talk about parameters. Parameters let you control and narrow down what the API works with. In HighLevel's documentation, the word parameters is used broadly. Sometimes a parameter lives directly in the URL path, like a calendar ID. Other times, it appears as a query value after the question mark. Either way, they serve the same purpose. They tell the API exactly which data to act on. For example, when calling the Get Free Slots API, we include parameters like start date, end date. This defines the exact time window we want to check. That's why parameters are so important. They're what make your API requests precise and intentional. Now let's talk about data, also known as the request body. This is the information you send when creating or updating something. For example, when creating a new contact, you send this. This format is called JSON, which simply organizes data into labeled values. Think of it like filling out a form. First name is the label, John is the value. Every piece of data is written as label, value. Now notice something important. All JSON data is wrapped inside curly brackets, open curly bracket and close curly bracket. Inside those brackets, we separate each field using commas, just like this. This structure allows different systems to understand each other clearly and consistently. And once you understand this format, reading API documentation becomes much easier. That naturally leads to an important question. Do you always need all 5 parts? Before we answer that, there's one key distinction to understand. You'll often hear the terms path and path parameter, and they're related, but they're not the same thing. The path is the fixed structure of the URL. It defines what type of resource you're working with. For example, this part of the URL. Everything here is part of the path.
A path parameter is the variable inside that path, the part that changes. When calendar ID is replaced with a real value like this, calendars/abc123/free slots, that value is the path parameter. It tells the API which exact record you want to act on. In HighLevel, if a path parameter appears in the URL, it's required, because without it, the system doesn't know which contact, appointment, or calendar you're referring to. Now, with that distinction in mind, let's answer the question: do you always need all 5 parts of an API request? Here's the nuance. Most requests only require a subset of these components. You don't always need all 5 parts. For a simple GET request, where you're only retrieving data, you typically need destination, yes, action, yes, authentication, yes, path parameters, yes. Path parameters are required when you're targeting a specific record. Query parameters, yes, or optional. Query parameters are used for filtering or narrowing results. Data, no, not required. But for a POST request, where you're creating something new, data becomes mandatory. And for PUT or patch requests, where you're updating existing records, data is also required. Now that you understand the core concepts of APIs, let's move into the HighLevel API documentation and show you how to read it, understand it, and actually use it like a pro. You'll find the documentation link in the description below if you want to follow along. When you open any HighLevel API page, you'll notice it follows a consistent layout. Every endpoint is organized into 5 core sections: destination and action, requirements, request, responses, request example, and playground. Let's start at the top and move through each section in order. Number 1, destination and action. You'll see the HTTP method and the full URL. For example, GET, which is the HTTP method, and this, which is the URL. This immediately tells you 2 things: where the request is being sent, the destination, and what type of action is being performed, GET, POST, and so on. When you see a value prefixed with a colon, like :calendar ID, that's a path parameter. Path parameters are required because they identify which specific resource the API should act on. Number 2, requirements. This next section is easy to overlook, but it's important. The requirements section tells you what's needed before this API call will work at all. Specifically, it shows scopes, the permissions the token must have, and auth methods, how the request can be authenticated, and token types, whether the token must be agency level or sub-account level. A simple way to think about it is: requirements answer the question, do I have the right permissions, the right auth method, and the right token type to make this request? If any one of these is missing or incorrect, the API call won't go through. Number 3, request. This is where most of the detail lives. HighLevel groups everything related to the request itself under this section. That includes headers, instructions sent with the request that affect how the API handles it, path parameters, variables inside the URL that identify which specific resource the request is targeting, query parameters, optional values added after the question mark to filter or narrow results, and the request body, the JSON data sent when creating or updating records. Even though HighLevel labels all of these under the request section and often refers to them collectively as parameters, they serve very different roles. A simple way to think about it is: headers control how the request is handled, path parameters choose the record, query parameters refine the result, the body carries the data. Number 4, Responses. The Responses section shows you what comes back from the API. That includes success status codes or error status codes, and the response data returned in each case. This section tells you whether the request succeeded or failed, what data you can expect in the response, and how to identify and debug errors. The fifth and final section is Request Example and Playground. This is our favorite section because this is where the documentation stops being theoretical and becomes practical. Here, HighLevel provides request examples that show the complete structure of a call and a visual playground where you can test the request directly. These examples show the request exactly as it's sent, including headers, parameters, and any required data. The playground allows you to test and validate your setup so you can confirm everything works before using the same configuration elsewhere. Together, this section acts as a reference and testing ground for everything you've just learned. Also here, you'll see examples in different formats: curl, node.js, Python, PHP, and Java. These show how to call the same API using different programming languages. But since we're building no-code systems, we will primarily focus on curl. Now that you understand the documentation layout, let's apply it to a real example. We'll take Create Contact and map it using HighLevel's actual documentation structure, so everything you see on screen lines up exactly with what we're explaining. At the top of the page, you'll see the HTTP method and the destination URL. For Create Contact, it looks like this. This tells us a few important things right away. The HTTP method is POST, which means we are creating something. This is the destination the request is being sent to. There are no path parameters in the URL, and that's expected. Because we're creating a brand new contact, there's no ID in the URL. Path parameters only appear when you're acting on an existing record, for example, updating or retrieving a specific contact. So here, the combination of POST and this URL clearly defines what we're doing and where the request is going. Next, we come to the Requirements section. This section tells us what must be in place before this request will work. HighLevel breaks this into 3 parts. First, we have scopes. For the Create Contact endpoint, the required scope is contacts.write. This means your API token must be allowed to create or modify contact records. If your token doesn't include this scope, the request will fail. Next is auth methods. Here, HighLevel shows the supported ways to authenticate this request. You'll see options like OAuth access token, private integration token. For this video, we're using a private integration token. It's more beginner-friendly than OAuth because it doesn't require additional setup, making it ideal for no-code workflows. We'll generate this token shortly. Finally, we have token types. This endpoint requires a sub-account token, not an agency token. That's because contacts, along with appointments, conversations, and calendars, all live inside sub-accounts, not at the agency level. If you use an agency token here, the request will fail, even if everything else is configured correctly. Now we reach header parameters. This is one of the most commonly misunderstood parts of the documentation. Here, HighLevel explicitly lists just one header, version. At first glance, that can feel incomplete. The reason is that HighLevel assumes some headers, like authorization, content type, and accept, are already understood as part of a standard API request. To see the full and accurate set of headers, you always want to look at the curl example in the top right. The curl example shows the request exactly as it's sent. From that example, we can see these headers: content type, application JSON, accept, application JSON, authorization, bearer, token. You might notice that version isn't visible here yet. That's because the version header is controlled by the request playground. If you scroll down and select a version in the playground, it will then appear in the generated curl. Don't worry if this feels confusing right now. We'll show the final complete curl request later, so you have a clean reference.
To recap, in practice, we need 4 headers in total. Content type, application/JSON, accept, application/JSON, version 2021-0728, authorization, bearer, token. Even though HighLevel refers to these as parameters, functionally, these are headers. A simple way to think about them is headers don't change what we're creating, they control access and how the request is handled. Here's a quick translation on what each header does. Content type tells the API we're sending JSON. Accept tells the API we expect JSON back. Version tells HighLevel which API version to use. Authorization carries your API token. This is why the curl example gives us the cleanest and most accurate picture of the real request structure.
Next is the path and query parameters. For the create contact endpoint, this request does not use either of them. There are no path parameters because we're not acting on an existing contact, and no query parameters because we're not filtering or narrowing results. This is expected for a create operation. It's a good reminder that not every request uses path or query parameters. In this case, create contact is driven almost entirely by the request body, where we define the contact details along with the required headers that control authentication and request handling. Now we're at the request body, and this is the most important part of the create contact request. For post requests like this, the request body is what defines what gets created. You'll see a JSON schema that looks like this. This JSON is the data you're sending to HighLevel. A few key things to understand here. This data is required. This is what actually creates the contact. If required fields are missing, the API will return error responses. A simple way to remember it is, for post requests, the request body is the request.
So what data do you actually need to send? In the documentation, you'll see fields such as first name, last name, email, phone, and location ID. Now here's something important to call out. The documentation marks location ID as required, and that part is correct. However, based on real-world testing, that's not the complete picture. To successfully create a contact, you must provide location ID and at least one unique identifier, email or phone. HighLevel uses email or phone to prevent duplicate contacts. Even though the documentation doesn't spell this out clearly, if you send location ID without an email or phone, the request will fail. This is something many HighLevel users run into, and it's a great example of why testing matters just as much as reading the docs. Now let's move to the response section. This part of the documentation shows the status codes the API can return, so you know whether your request worked and how to troubleshoot it if it didn't. A 201 status code confirms that the contact was created successfully, and the API returns the full contact record. You'll also see common error codes listed here. 400 indicates a bad request, and it's usually due to malformed input. 401 means authentication failed because the token is missing or invalid. 422 means the request was understood, but required data is missing. This section helps you quickly understand what went wrong and why, which is critical when you're testing or debugging API calls. If you'd like a full walkthrough on debugging HighLevel API errors, let us know in the comments and we can make a dedicated video. Now that we've walked through the full create contact request, from the destination all the way to the response, let's zoom out and map this back to the 5-part model. Here's how this request lines up. Destination, required. This defines the contact's resource we're sending the request to.
Action, required. We're using post because we're creating something new. Authentication, required. The API needs to know who's making the request and which account it belongs to. Path parameters, not used. There's no existing contact yet, so there's no ID in the URL. Query parameters, not used. We're not filtering or narrowing results. Request body, required. This is where the actual contact information lives. This highlights a pattern you'll see again and again. Many post requests don't rely on path or query parameters. They rely almost entirely on the request body. And this is an important takeaway. Create contact is a perfect example of how not every API call uses every part, but every part still has a clear and intentional role.
Now let's look at the Get Free Slots API endpoint in HighLevel's documentation. Get Free Slots is the perfect contrast to Create Contact because this is where parameters actually matter. We'll map it the same way, using HighLevel's real documentation layout, and this time you'll clearly see how path and query parameters come into play. At the top, you're given two core pieces of information, the HTTP method, which is GET, and the destination URL. That destination URL includes calendar ID, which is a path parameter, and it's required. This tells us a few important things right away. We're retrieving data, not creating anything. The request is scoped to one specific calendar. The calendar ID must be provided or the request can't work. That leads us to an important point. If you want free slots, the system has to know which calendar you're checking. That's why the calendar ID lives directly in the URL.
The requirements here are very similar, with one key difference. The required scope is calendars.read-only, which means the token must have permission to read calendar data. The authentication method and token type stay the same. We're still using a private integration token and a sub-account token. Now let's move into the request section, starting with the headers. The headers here work exactly the same way as they did for Create Contact. They don't affect which slots we get. They control authentication, response format, and API versioning. You'll see the same required headers. Here's the key thing to remember. Even though this is a GET request, the headers are still required. GET requests feel simpler, so it's common to assume they don't need much setup. But in HighLevel, GET does not mean unauthenticated or lightweight. The API still needs to know who you are via the authorization header. It still needs to know which API version to use via the version header. And it still needs to know how to format the response via the accept header. As always, the curl example gives you the most accurate picture of the real request, including the active API version.
This is where Get Free Slots gets interesting. This endpoint uses both path and query parameters. The calendar ID is a path parameter, and it lives directly in the URL. What it does is simple. It identifies which calendar we're querying and anchors the request to a specific resource. Without it, the request doesn't know where to look. Start date and end date are query parameters, added after the question mark. What they do is also simple. They define the time window and narrow down which availability the API should return. To pass these query parameters into the request, they're added directly to the URL. And when you include more than one query parameter, they're separated by an ampersand, the AND symbol. So here's the key distinction to remember. The calendar ID tells the API where to look. The query parameters tell it when to look. For Get Free Slots, we're not sending any JSON data in the request body. Since all of that context lives in the URL and its parameters, a request body isn't needed. And that's expected because we're not creating or updating anything. We're just retrieving information. This is a contrast with Create Contact. In Create Contact, the request body is required because you're sending new data to the system. Here, with Get Free Slots, you're only supplying identifiers and filters, so the body is intentionally empty. A simple rule of thumb you can keep in mind. When you're asking for data, the request usually relies on path and query parameters. When you're sending data, that's when the request body comes into play. Error responses work the same way as create contact, so nothing new to learn here. Now that we've walked through Get Free Slots, let's zoom out and map it back to the 5-part model. In this table, you can see exactly how this request lines up. The destination is required because it points to the free slots resource. The action is get, since we're retrieving data, not creating anything. Authentication is required to access calendar data. The path parameter, the calendar ID, is mandatory because the API needs to know which calendar to check. The query parameters define the time range, telling the API when to look. And unlike create contact, there's no data body at all. Once you see this pattern, it becomes much clearer why endpoints are structured the way they are, and you can often predict what an endpoint will need before you even read the details. At this point, you have everything you need to navigate HighLevel's API docs with confidence, even when they look complex at first. Now that you understand how to read HighLevel's API documentation, let's move forward and generate your private integration key with the correct scope. This is the key that allows you to make your very first API call. Let's learn how to generate one. First, go to Settings, then click Private Integrations. Next, click Create New Integration. You can name this anything you want. Let's just call this one Test API 1. Now here's the important part, scopes. Scopes define what this key is allowed to do. Always refer back to the API documentation to see which scope is required. Since we're creating a new contact, the documentation tells us we need contacts.write. So let's select contacts.write here. Now click Create. HighLevel will instantly generate your private integration key. This key is extremely sensitive. Treat it like a password. Copy it, store it somewhere safe, and never expose it publicly. We're going to use this key in just a moment inside the request playground to make our very first real API call. Now that we've generated our private integration key, it's time to put it to work. Let's go back to the HighLevel API documentation and scroll down to the Request Playground section. This is where we'll make our first real API call. As you can see, the base URL is already filled in for us, so we don't need to touch that. Now let's move to the Auth section. For the bearer token field, paste in the private integration key we just generated. Next, Parameters section. Here, we only need to select the version header. There's only one available option, so just select that. Now let's move to the body section. You'll see that HighLevel already provides a sample JSON structure. Since this is your very first API call, let's keep things simple. Let's replace everything with a clean, simple JSON example like this. Now let's quickly understand what we're doing here. This entire structure is written in JSON format. It always starts with an opening curly bracket and ends with a closing curly bracket. Each field follows the same pattern: variable name inside quotes, a colon, then the value, also inside quotes. When adding multiple fields, we separate them using commas. The last field does not need a comma. That's it. That's JSON. Now let's replace the values for each field. For first name, we'll just use John. For last name, Smith. For the email, we'll add John's email here. Next is the location ID. To get this, go back to HighLevel, open Settings, then Business Profile, and copy your location ID. Now jump back to the playground and paste it right here. And for phone, just enter John's phone number. Now we're ready to test. Click Send API Request. Perfect! We got a 201 status code, which means the request was successful. And here's the response from HighLevel, showing us the full contact object: ID, name, email, phone, and much more.
Now let's jump back into HighLevel and confirm that the contact was actually created. Perfect. Our new contact is right here. One more important thing to notice. If we scroll back up to the curl section, you'll see that the full request is now automatically generated for us based on our inputs. This is extremely useful because we can reuse this exact structure when building workflows in HighLevel and n8n. And that's exactly what we'll do next. Now that we've successfully tested the API in the playground, let's run the exact same API call inside HighLevel automation using a custom webhook action. The custom webhook action allows you to call any external API, including HighLevel's own API. This is incredibly powerful, and it's completely no code. Let's walk through this step by step. On a new HighLevel workflow, add New Action, Custom Webhook. First, the action name and event name can stay as default. Next, the method. Since we're creating a new contact, the documentation tells us to use post, so select post here. Now we need the destination URL. We can copy this directly from the curl example we just generated. Paste that into the URL field. Next, keep authorization set to none because we're going to handle authentication inside the headers. Now let's configure the headers. Click Add Item. As you can see, there are two input fields, key and value. To get the correct header values, let's go back to the curl example. You'll notice several lines that start with -h. These represent all the headers required by this API. Let's copy them one by one. First header. From curl, you'll see content type, application/JSON. So key is content type, and value is application/JSON. Paste those into the header fields. Click Add Item again. Second header. From curl, except application/JSON. So key, except, value, application/JSON. Paste that in. Click Add Item again. From curl, version 2021-07-28, so key, version, value, 2021-07-28. Paste that in. Click Add Parameter one more time to add the last header. From curl, authorization, bearer, your token. So, key, authorization. For the value, copy everything starting from bearer, including your full private integration key. Paste it exactly as shown. Perfect. Now our header section matches the curl request exactly. And this is a very important habit to build. Whenever you're unsure about headers, always reference the curl example. It shows you precisely what the API expects. Now let's move to the raw body. Go back to the curl example again. Look for the section labeled data-raw. Copy everything from the opening curly bracket to the closing curly bracket. Paste that directly into the raw body field. Since HighLevel prevents duplicate contacts, let's modify the values slightly. Let's change first name to Sarah, last name to Johnson, email to sarah@johnson.com, and phone to a different number. Now we're ready to test. Enable Save Response, then click Send Test Request. Select any existing contact to trigger the test. Click Send Test Request. Perfect. Another 201 response, which means it worked. Now let's check the Contacts page. And there we go. Our new contact is created successfully. Now we'll show you how to run the exact same API call in n8n using the HTTP node. The HTTP node in n8n works very similar to the custom webhook in HighLevel. Once you understand one, you basically understand both. On a new n8n workflow, click Add Node and select HTTP Request. Now let's configure it step by step. The first field is Method. Since we are creating a new contact, choose Post. For the URL, go back to the curl example from the documentation. Copy the destination URL and paste it here. For authentication, select None. Just like before, we'll handle authentication using headers. Leave Send Query parameters turned off because we don't need any parameters for this API. Now toggle Send Headers. You'll see the first row appear where you can add name and value. Just like in HighLevel, we're going to reference the curl to get the correct headers. Go back to the curl example. Look for the lines starting with -h. From curl, content type, application, JSON. So, name, content type, value, application, JSON. Paste that in. Click Add Parameter to add second header. From curl, accept, application, JSON. So, name, accept, value, application, JSON. Paste that in. Click Add Parameter again to add third header. From curl version 2021-07-28, so name, version, value, 2021-07-28. Paste that in. Click Add Parameter one more time to add the last header. Authorization, bearer, your token. So name, authorization. For the value, copy everything starting from bearer, including your full token. Paste it here. Perfect. Now our headers are fully configured. And again, notice the pattern. Whenever you're unsure, just follow the curl. Now toggle Send Body. You'll see Body Content Type, which is already defaulted to JSON, exactly what we need. For Specify Body, select Using JSON. Now go back to the curl example. Find the Data Raw section. Copy everything from the opening curly bracket to the closing curly bracket. Paste that directly into the JSON body field. Since HighLevel prevents duplicate contacts, let's change the values. First name to Tara, last name to Wang, email to tarawang@gmail.com, and phone to a different number. Now we're ready to run the API. Click Execute Step. Perfect! We immediately get a successful response, including all the contact details. Now let's check inside HighLevel. And there we go. Tara Wang is created successfully. Now we're going to show you a trick, the fastest and most efficient way to build API calls inside n8n. Instead of manually filling everything in, we can generate the entire request in seconds. Let's add a brand new HTTP node. Now look for this button, Import curl. Click it. Go back to the documentation and copy the entire curl command. Paste it directly into the import box. Before clicking Import, change the values inside the JSON body so we create a brand new contact. Now click Import. Boom! All the fields are automatically populated. Method, URL, headers, body. Everything is done for you. Now click Execute Step. Perfect! It works. This single trick lets you build workflows faster, avoid configuration mistakes, and learn API structures visually. Once you master this, n8n becomes insanely unmatched in its practicality. And that's it. One quick tip before we wrap up. HighLevel's API documentation can sometimes be inaccurate or incomplete. So if you ever get stuck calling a specific endpoint or you need help understanding how to structure a request properly, consider joining our SKOOL community. Inside, we're building a growing library of practical API tutorials, walking step by step through real high-level endpoints, with the goal of eventually covering every major API in the platform. And if you're new to HighLevel or you simply need extra subaccounts for testing and development, this is a great time to join. We provide community members with access to high-level subaccounts, so you can experiment, build, and learn without friction. Since you're already diving into APIs, this video is a perfect next watch. We show you how to build a custom high-level MCP system.
Drop any questions in the comments, and if this helped, make sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.